Carola Racketa, who defied the Italian authorities to land the rescue ship Sea-Watch 3 in Sicily with 50 migrants on board. To some, she's become a humanitarian hero. But will her actions merely encourage more people smuggling and more suffering? Carola Racketa, welcome to Hard Talk.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
You have emerged from an extraordinary experience earlier this summer, which saw you captaining a rescue vessel in the Mediterranean, picking up almost 50 or so migrants, ending up docking in Italy in defiance of the Italian authorities, and then in detention for a while. How much of a toll has that experience taken on you?
Well, I've first been volunteering with this organization in 2016.
It's called Sea-Watch.
Yeah, Sea-Watch. And when you talk to the refugees who come from Libya, a country at civil war, and you understand what they have been through, then risking a bit of your white privilege suddenly is very, very little.
You were the captain of Sea-Watch 3, one of the vessels that has been in the Mediterranean monitoring, looking out for people in desperate straits on the sea, often in dinghies which appear to be about to sink. When you signed up, were you aware of just how potentially controversial and difficult your mission was going to be?
Well, when I first started volunteering in 2016, it was a completely different situation. There was a lot of mutual support with the authorities, the European military, and particularly the Italian Coast Guard. But then in 2017, the first rescue vessel, the Juvente, was arrested. And from that moment onwards, particularly the captains, but all the crew understand that there is a risk of criminalization. So the scene over these years has changed completely.
So when you picked up I believe it was 40 or 50 migrants who were in deep trouble in the sea, about 40 or 50 miles off the coast of Libya, was it immediately in your mind that you had a problem here and you had to think very carefully about what to do?
Well, we were very aware of the difficult political situation. As you mentioned, this is a situation which has been growing over years. So there's a lack of solidarity within the European Union to distribute the people who arrive over the sea route. And due to the Dublin III system, that burden is carried by the states of the southern border of Italy. And that is a situation which is caused by the states in Central Europe and Northern Europe, because they don't want to change the rules.
No, and we'll get to the politics of this in some detail later, but just paint a picture for me of what condition the people were in that you came across on Sea-Watch 3 in early June 2019. Who were they? What condition?
Yeah, there were 53 people on a rubber dinghy, which we know from experience is very unstable. I've seen them sink within minutes once they deflate. None of the people had life jackets. There were 2 infants, pregnant women, no navigation equipment, no food and no water. So by the maritime law, that is a distress case, because you can be sure these people cannot arrive to any port.
And were they begging you to take them on board your vessel, the Sea-Watch?
Yeah, they're definitely aware how dangerous the situation is. People are terrified on board these boats. They know they can break, they can capsize. Sometimes people fall overboard. In 2017, for example, I rescued a 2-year-old boy whose father had fallen overboard just 3 or 4 hours ago.
You mentioned the infants and the pregnant women. What was it predominantly young men, or was it a real mix of people?
I think in this case, we had about 10 women and children, and the rest were men.
Right. You, of course, had a choice to make at the very beginning. You were much closer to the Libyan coastline than you were to anywhere in southern Europe. I believe roughly 40 miles off the coast of Libya. The Libyan Coast Guard is now committed, thanks to EU support, EU finance, equipment and training. They are committed to clamping down on the people smuggling, and they want all of those who attempt to cross to be returned to Libya. Why didn't you return them to Libya?
Well, it would be breaking the Geneva Convention about the non-refoulement, because we know that these people are suffering human rights abuses in Libya, also in the detention centers. This could be kidnapping, torture, forced labor.
But the EU are partners of the Libyan Coast Guard.
Yeah.
Libya is working with the EU. Are you saying that you not for one second would trust the Libyans to look after the basic human needs of these people?
Not for 1 second. We have a lot of experience with them, and these human rights abuses are well documented by the EU as well. They know exactly what they are doing and who they are financing. The Libyan Coast Guard has evolved from various warlords which have just taken control of the boats, which existed 2015, 2016. They're now financed, but they're also complicit, and that is known, in many human rights abuses. And there have been cases where the Coast Guard disrupted our rescues, leading to the death of people in the rescue scene.
Now, as we've established, even in the course of this conversation, you were very well aware of the legal and political context in Italy, but nonetheless, you decided to take the Sea Watch toward southern Italy, toward Sicily, and you ultimately spent days and days floating around, I guess, beginning a dialogue with the Italians, or at least asking them for permission to land, enter Italian territorial waters and land your passengers. Mm-hmm. Now, what did the Italians say to you?
Well, the Italians said they were not responsible for this rescue case because it had been carried out in the Libyan Zar zone.
Which is true.
Which is true, which means that the Libyans have to coordinate it. However, Libya doesn't have any port of safety, and that also has been stated clearly by the EU Commission. So we would be breaking the law, bringing people to Libya. So when we requested Italy after 2 days, there was a German city, medium-sized city, which offered to take all the people and even send a bus to Sicily to pick them up. But unfortunately, both the Interior Ministry of Germany and of Italy didn't want to agree on this solution.
But the law is the law, passed by a democratic government in Italy, and you were well aware of the law. That is, it's illegal for a rescue vessel such as yours to enter Italian territorial waters, and still more illegal to attempt to land at an Italian port. And yet, in the end, you did that. Why?
Well, two laws are in conflict with each other here. It's the maritime law, which says that you have a duty to rescue, and your rescue is completed when you bring people to a port of safety. And then you have the national law in this case, which prohibits the entry. So we were waiting in order not to break the law, and we were hoping for a political solution, such as offered by this German city, so that the people could be disembarked outside the territorial waters, and that would have prevented the whole scenario which followed.
And while you were waiting, I just wonder what condition the passengers, the migrants on your ship were in, and how much pressure did you feel to do something to get them off the ship?
Well, the situation was worsening every day, particularly the psychological situation. So nearly all these people have been in different types of prison camps or have suffered from human rights abuses, as already mentioned. Some suffered from post-traumatic stress disorders. Some suffered from torture wounds which hadn't been treated properly because they didn't have access to health care. And the pure worry of not knowing where your future leads you and what will happen led to the fact that people were severely disturbed, and the doctors in the end, my medical team in the end said that we couldn't guarantee the safety of the people anymore.
You must have, obviously, you and your team spoken to them at some length over the course of what was in effect roughly 2 weeks of this journey. So you heard some of their stories. Where were they from? And did you form an opinion as to whether these were largely economic migrants or people seeking asylum because they were fleeing conflict and persecution?
They came from various sub-Sahara countries, most of them. And I think it's very interesting to think about why these people migrate. And I think it largely has to do as well with the environmental breakdown, which we are, like industrial nations, are causing. So most people like to stay at home, really, if they can. But the socioeconomic conditions are so difficult in many countries that people have no choice other than to go somewhere else.
That's your judgment. That doesn't necessarily match what in international law constitutes refugee status, but we'll get back to that in a minute. I just want to finish the amazing story of June, because after not getting permission to land in Italy, you in the end took the law into your own hands. You piloted your vessel into the Sicilian port against the wishes of the authorities. You slammed into what appears to have been some sort of police boat, squeezing it, according to the Italians, against the harbour in a, they say, very dangerous fashion. It does seem in the end you were pushing the very edge of safety and responsible behaviour in your decision to land your boat.
Well, there's quite a few videos of the scene which everyone is invited to watch. The maneuver was very slow. The people who were at risk really were the refugees who we had on board, and the Italian authorities had 17 days to resolve the situation, and they didn't.
Well, they say, and indeed they charged you with illegally entering their territorial waters and also for endangering the safety of an Italian police vessel. And they charged you, and for a while it looked as though you were going to stay under arrest, house arrest, in Italy for some time. At that point, were you beginning to regret what you'd done?
No, I certainly didn't regret what happened. I regret that there's such a lack of solidarity within the European Union. I mean, it's just 4,000 people who arrived from this route this year to Italy. So I really regret that we do have that situation at all. And I think it's outrageous that we cannot give people access to their human rights.
Well, isn't the very point that you've just made, that there are now so many fewer people making the crossing and ending up in Italy or indeed Malta or southern Spain from the sea route, doesn't that make the point that Mr. Salvini, who is the sort of poster politician for a new, tough, anti-migrant policy in southern Europe, his policy is working as a deterrent? It has actively deterred many, many would-be migrants from making that highly dangerous crossing.
Well, we don't know that because we haven't spoken to them, I guess.
But they're just not coming, that's the point.
Yeah, and the question is why they are not coming. I mean, the European Union is building a border. They're doing an externalization of that border already far south of Libya. So they're already deterring people from entering into there. They're also pulling back via the Libyan Coast Guard people to a country at civil war. And the death numbers are as high as they have never been in the relative death numbers.
Well, yeah, they're not,
exactly.
In absolute terms, they're not as high, but the number of deaths of migrants at sea is proportionately higher now as a proportion of the overall number making the crossing than it was in 2015, 2016, when the overall figures were far higher. But let's get back to the figures because they're quite extraordinary. Arrivals by sea to Italy have dropped by 84% from the 2018 figure, 97% down from the 2017 figure. So right now, as we speak today, Italy, with its tough stand, has ensured, let us be honest, that thousands of people who were going to attempt to make that crossing and would have put themselves at risk are no longer doing so. That should be celebrated, shouldn't it?
I'm not sure that the credit here goes to the Italians. It's the whole of the European Union which has withdrawn their rescue vessels and which is complicit in the Libyan Coast Guard pulling back these people, as I said, to a country at civil war.
Would you not accept that, and you're right, it's not just Italy, but Spain and Malta and Greece as well, all of whom now have a real tough stand on not wanting to let these vessels land and actually launching criminal prosecutions of some of the rescue mission workers, such as yourself. This has had a real effect on the mentality of people who might have made the crossing. And you surely don't want tens and tens of thousands of people to make that crossing, do you?
I think we have to see the fact that migration as such is just a fact of human lives. I mean, everyone outside Africa has come from Africa sometime, right? The point is that due to the whole, say, history of colonization, the large inequalities between the global poor and the global rich, there is a lot of reasons for people to migrate. And there's a lot of injustice between people around the globe. And as long as we don't resolve that, people will just migrate, and particularly due to the climate breakdown.
Well, we'll get to the climate breakdown and how important you feel that is as a push factor away from sub-Saharan Africa in particular. But let's just stick with this notion of yours that migration is just a fact of life. I come back to the figures which suggest actually there's been a fundamental change in the last couple of years. And I also come to the fact that some players in the Mediterranean are quite clear that the rescue missions that the private humanitarian organizations such as Sea-Watch run are actually counterproductive. The head of the EU border agency Frontex, Fabrice Leggeri, said this a couple of years ago when he was looking at what groups like yours were doing. He said that rescue operations need re-evaluating. He said that NGOs are ineffectively cooperating with national security agencies. And he said NGOs who rescue people in the sea off Libya are actually encouraging the people traffickers who profit from dangerous Mediterranean crossings.
Yeah, and such accusations have been also mentioned against the Italian Coast Guard when they were rescuing during Mare Nostrum.
Which they no longer do.
Which they no longer do, but it was the absolutely same accusations. In the week that Sea-Watch started their operation, 1,000 people drowned. So it was first people were trying to cross the sea, and then the civil NGOs were a reply to that. It wasn't the other way around.
But address Frontex's testimony. They've had officials in North Africa who have spoken, for example, to the people smugglers, the traffickers in Libya, who have said, who've openly acknowledged putting people onto these dinghies which are clearly not seaworthy, not capable of travelling the 200 miles to southern Italy. And they say, well, we don't care if they can't make the 200-mile crossing. All they need to do is get 20 or 30 miles offshore out of Libyan territorial waters, and we know that these NGOs will pick them up and take them to Italy. You're, in a sense, offering a taxi service, and the people smugglers are exploiting you.
Well, you can also look at the numbers from this year, where, for example, on the days where there were rescue ships out there, on average there were 33 people leaving from the shore, and on the other days when there was no ships, the number was 35.
I just wonder if you feel you're not being a little patronising, not least to the Libyans. Throughout this interview, you've said that you don't trust a word the Libyans say, that you think the conditions inside Libya and the detention centres for migrants are appalling and inhumane and contravene international law. The Libyans respond by saying that you, NGOs, do not respect them and that you won't work with them and that you are consistently undermining their activities.
Well, we do cooperate to the degree which is complicit with the law, but we can, of course, not accept instructions such as bringing people back to Libya, because that will be a non-compliance as set with the Geneva Convention on Refugee Rights.
You've mentioned the international conventions concerning migrants at several points in this interview. I just wonder, from your experience yourself, working with Sea-Watch for some time, whether you truly believe that most of the people crossing from North Africa, attempting to get into southern Europe, are genuinely fleeing persecution and conflict, or whether so many of them are actually, for very understandable reasons, economic migrants?
Well, they all come from Libya. And
Well,
Libya
they come
is
through
a country.
Libya. Most of them are not Libyans.
Libya is a country at civil war. So in my position, I'm a sea captain, right? And I see the boat in distress, and it really is not my position to judge how and why someone came here. And if you wanted to know that, I think it would be interesting if you were talking to these people, and then you could ask them why they're traveling, and they could give you the reasons.
But you see, you say it's not my position to judge, and I well understand that, but it seems to me at points you do judge. For example, you've said to me, oh, many of these people who've come through Libya from sub-Saharan Africa, they're what you call climate refugees, and you've said in the past that Europe has a duty to accept these climate refugees. But, I mean, that may well be your moral, ethical position, but that doesn't match international law, and it certainly doesn't mean that they are eligible for refugee status.
Yeah, I mean, international law or law as such is an interesting thing because it's always formed by the society, right? And it can change. You see there were times where, for example, slavery was legal, women didn't have a right to vote. That doesn't mean it's morally right. And climate breakdown as such is still a fairly new topic, if you want. So it's still not included in the UN refugee rights.
No, it's
but
not.
It doesn't mean that it's not going to happen in the future.
But it does
and
mean
it
that if
also
you and
doesn't mean
others
it's
like you-
morally right.
Sorry to interrupt, I'm just exercised by this because if you are to take your logic to its conclusion, you would, and other NGOs would recognize the obligation to help these what you call climate refugees, and there could be millions of them, literally millions of them, seeking over the next 10, 20, 30 years to enter Europe. Are you saying that Europe has a legal as well as moral obligation to take all of these migrants?
Well, we have to look at the facts, which are first and foremost that most people, when they migrate, they go very, very short distances because especially the global poor just don't have the money to move very far. So when we are thinking of the effects of climate breakdown, like changes in precipitation, crop failures, famine, most people will starve very close to their homes. They're not going to come here. You know, the percentage of people who cross a border is very low. Most then stay in neighboring countries. So really we're talking about possibly or much, likely higher numbers than we have now. But most people who will be displaced, think of Wales. You have coastal erosion, for example. Some people will have to move homes and so on. But they're not going to Canada, they're going short distance.
Your view of the moral, ethical obligations is very different from that of most people in Europe. Do you recognise that in the end democracy has to be acknowledged and recognised and respected in Europe? According to the Pew Research Centre, 71% of Italians want fewer immigrants or no immigrants at all. Very different from your perspective.
Yeah, and I think that opinion probably comes from, as I already pointed out now several times, the lack of solidarity within Europe when we're talking about receiving these
people have a solidarity. They have a
And-
solidarity to what they see as defending their national interest.
Yeah, and when we see, for example, people in Germany which have been surveyed, I think in June, then 65% said they would like to welcome people. So there's differences within the European Union. And I certainly understand that Italy was bearing a far too great share of the responsibility within the EU.
Final thing, will you go back to sea again and conduct more rescue missions?
Yes, I certainly would. However, I'm a nature conservationist, so I might work on other issues in the future.
Carola Rackete, it's been a pleasure to have you on Hard Talk. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Steve.
Thank you.
If there is a war, then I do not think anybody will be safe in our region. But let us all try to avoid one. We don't need a war.
I do have a voice that I can use, and how do I use that in a positive way?
The number one priority is to restore the Greek economy to an aggressive growth path.
Many problem is our own creation.
This is an emergency. This is an existential crisis, and we must do everything we can to stop it.
I don't want to just have my face in the paper or have my name as the patron. I want to do more than that.
When big names talk, they talk to the BBC.
Hello there. Hurricane Dorian has brought some devastation to some of the islands in the north of the Bahamas over the last couple of days. Now, this severe system, Category 5, almost stationary, has weakened somewhat in the last 24 hours, although it still remains a major storm as it continues to now move north and northwestwards along the southeast coastline of the United States. So hurricane warnings remain in force here for high surf. Across South America, plenty of storms and showers across the northwest. Lots of sunshine, central southern areas. Quite cold, though, further south, and only 11 degrees in Buenos Aires on Wednesday afternoon. As I head on into Europe, there's plenty of warmth across the east and into the Mediterranean. A few thunderstorms around Italy, the Adriatic into the Balkans, but it remains cooler than average across the northwest, thanks to northwesterly winds, areas of cloud and rain. The African easterly wave storms remain in full motion now. Really intense storms again on Thursday across all central areas. Across the north, though, it remains mainly dry. Plenty of dry weather as well across the Middle East. We've had very high temperatures across the top end of the Gulf. It looks like those temperatures may come down a few degrees by the time we reach the weekend, thanks to a change in wind direction. Very wet across central northern India and into southern Pakistan. These monsoon rains don't look like letting up anytime soon. The far north into northern Pakistan, it stays dry with plenty of sunshine. A couple of tropical depressions, tropical storms across the West Pacific and into the South China Sea. This one to the east of Taiwan is Typhoon Ling Ling. That's going to continue to strengthen as it pushes north into the Korean Peninsula. We've got a number of tropical depressions around the South China Sea. Finally, for Australasia, mainly dry for Australia, but we've got an area of low pressure swinging in across the southeastern Tasmania over the next few days, and this deep area of low pressure taking the gales and heavy rain away as we end the week. From New Zealand.
Now showing on BBC Real.
Yung balin sa sayaw, napakahalaga talaga yan para sa amin. Ang bawat ibon, pag nasa loob ka ng kuiba, pag hinawakan mo nga, talagang halikan mo. Kasi ang isang ibon yan, kung ilang libo yung binibigay niya na sayo talaga. Noon walang palipalipad yan eh. Ang isang concessionaire kasi noon, kapag nahawakan nila, gusto nila kumita. Mga ilang araw, pag pwede nang kunin yung, kukunin na nila eh. Nung itong huli na talaga, nung pinapangalagaan na namin itong isla, mas maingat kami sa pag-harvest ng mga pugad sa kuibahan. Busyador kami pa ang gwardiya.
Watch more stories like this at bbc.com/real.